Welcome to Blockchain All-Star Series. I'm your host, Layla Gulen. Blockchain and distributed ledger technology are at the forefront of the Internet 3.0 era, where the technology can enable trusted and transparent sharing of data and digital assets. Though the technology is still in its early stage, who makes up the constellation of innovators guiding us through the digital revolution powered by blockchain? Well, we'd like to welcome Yves La Rose. Yves is the executive director and founder of the EOS Network Foundation. After completing studies in psychology at the University of Ottawa, Yves moved to Japan, where he began his professional career in business and education. By 2010, he began mining Bitcoin, and the very next year went back to school to focus on perceptual and computational neuropsychology, it's a mouthful, and additional studies in behavioral economics. Today, Yves has dedicated himself to the EOS public blockchain. Yves, we are so happy to have you with us today.
Hi, thank you for having me, Layla.
So first and foremost, I have to ask you, what is computational neuropsychology?
It is a mouthful. And so basically, when I grew up with computers. So I started building computers and programming at a really young age. I started building computers, I think, when I was 6 years old. And growing up surrounded by technology, I always had that affinity for that tech stack. But at the same time, my heart really resided in the social aspect of human psychology. And computational neuropsychology is really the bridge between both disciplines, where I guess AI kind of lives in a certain sense. This idea, and this is where as well, behavioral economics, it's this idea behind how humans interact with technology and how effectively you'd actually be able to create some of the human capacities using technology. And so that's really where my studies were located.
That's very interesting. Just to kind of stay on that subject, I'm curious if you had any particular findings that would allow us to kind of peer through the window of exactly that, how humans relate to technology.
Not particularly, not that we're any useful. So that's one of the reasons why I stopped those studies. It was an extreme failure. I was attempting to recreate, to a certain extent, how the human brain would interact with computers, or I guess in recreating a human brain using computers. And obviously that's an extremely difficult field. And so it was a complete failure. But what it taught me was really some components of the human nature and the human aspect, how you're able to code some of it. And really that's what led me to blockchain in the end, is that there's certain aspects of, and for example, if you think about trust, what does trust mean for humans, and how we've been able to effectively through blockchain kind of recreate the trust layer, remove that trust layer through these networks. And so although the studies themselves were somewhat of a failure, the learnings through the studies really led me to this field as a whole, in order to be able to kind of fill the gaps that we could find within our society, leveraging that technology in order to create similar type of behaviors within different peoples, but also different populations.
When you talk about failures, I mean, I've interviewed so many people in this space and elsewhere, and when we talk about successful people and their quote unquote failures leading up to their success, I mean, they're really not failures at all, are they? Because they do lead to discoveries, and they are those building blocks that get you to where you are today.
Definitely. And I would say that failures, kind of like what you just described it, are an opportunity to learn. And so I've had multiple failures, and every step along the way, I think part of what maybe distinguishes certain people are how they deal with those failures, or what they do afterwards, after they failed. And if they have a capacity to actually pick themselves back up, learn from what just happened, take that learning and then apply it to something else. And so definitely failures for me I wouldn't see them necessarily as being negative.
No, absolutely not. Going back to 2010, so you started discovering and looking into Bitcoin. That's 12 years ago now. So that was really in its very nascent. So what was it about it that attracted you? And what did you possibly think? What was in your crystal ball as to where we would be today with all of this?
I'll talk about that one too, because that's somewhat of a failure again. But the idea, I guess at the time, putting yourself back during that period of time, was really the first decentralized network that was in a way very trustless, where you could somehow connect to a network, potentially generate, and you have to think back in 2010, 2011, very few people thought of this as an actual asset that would have as much value as it does today. You're talking about a few hundred, maybe a few thousand really computer nerds that weren't really thinking of the monetary aspect to it at all. It was mainly the capacity to be able to transact over long distance or over great distances without actually needing the trust between the individuals. And so that's really what attracted me to it. It was that decentralized nature of the network, being able to validate something that we weren't able to do before. And so that's really what attracted me to it. I did mine Bitcoin for a lengthy period of time. And what I guess the failure is that I saw that at some point, again, placing yourself back in during that period of time, you were able to mine on a laptop. You were able to mine considerable amounts of Bitcoin, which had very little value. We're talking about or I guess early maybe 5 cents, 10 cents or so, when I think I started 7 cents, 11 cents per Bitcoin. So there was very little value in there. And so you were mining 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Bitcoin per month on your laptop. And really all that did at the time was just enable you to buy more hardware. So it did have some minimal value, but it didn't have the value that it did today. So that's why I'd say it's a failure. I wish I would have kept a lot of what I mined at the time. And where I guess I kind of fell out. No, I don't, unfortunately. I wish I had the thousands and thousands of Bitcoin that I was mining monthly. I think at a peak, I was mining about 18 to 2,200 Bitcoin monthly during that period of time.
Wow. What would that be really, worth today?
Good question. I don't even want to know, really. A lot.
We'll pass on that question.
Yeah. But the idea as well was that at the time, because it was truly decentralized, there was no such thing as mining pools. So there are people that perhaps had a few rigs, but really, it really was a decentralized network of individuals. And where I somewhat left the space was when the ASICs miners didn't even come out. They were thinking of come out, or people were talking about them, and we were hearing about these specialized miners. I'm not even sure if they were called miners at the time, but specialized computational units that'd be able to accelerate the process. And it was evident to me that this would become somewhat of a business, and that it would really centralize the power of the network within those that spent the capital to be able to do so, which really went against the ethos as to why I joined. And so that's when I left the space, was when the first miners came out.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting.
Again, kind of a failure, because I could have continued in that space. But I did stay attached to the blockchain space throughout that whole time.
Yes, exactly, which I'd love to talk about in a moment here, because 2017, that was a very pivotal time for you. You began to seriously consider emerging blockchain and the whole industry. And then along with some of your associates, you had formed a blockchain book club. So maybe you can now take us through what you were doing in 2017 and how it's led to where you are today.
So after I left Japan, came back to Canada, I went back to studies, and that's where I really focused on the computational neuropsychology. But I also, I was applying to med school. I was going to go back. And so I did pre-med, I did all the science components to it. And during that period of time, I got poached by the government. So I come from Ottawa in Canada. It's the center of government in Canada. I'm bilingual. And so it's relatively easy to be able to work for the federal government. And with my experience and with the educational background that I had, the government came and poached me, and I started working as a policy advisor, but behavioral economist at the time. And that was interesting. That was nice, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And blockchain started rearing its head again in 2017, where obviously the ICO craze. And so there was a big focus and attention again on I guess what I would call at the time somewhat Gen 2 going to Gen 3 blockchain. So I'd left the space. I'd always kept an eye on the space, but it was still very niche. I mean, it's still niche today, but it was still very niche in the sense that it wasn't really a technology that you'd be able to use at the time to scale. So the capacities weren't there yet to be able to actually do something with it other than, you know, one-way transactions. But 2017 started to showcase a lot of people, relatively, of new innovations within the space that potentially could unlock this technology. And having that background and having the previous experience, it really started sparking my interest again. And so one thing led to the next, started, kind of catching up to what had happened over the last couple of years, especially since Ethereum. So 2015 to 2017. And I had the opportunity to leave the employment that I had and kind of that life that I had to jump back in full force within the space in, I guess, a different fashion that I'd done before.
Okay. And then let's talk about 2018. So that's when you co-founded EOS Nation. So tell us more about this company and the process, the journey that it took you to get there, and what you've done with it since.
So during that period of time in 2017, when I was really exploring the space, allocating capital and looking at what was possible, one of the things that stood out, obviously, during 2017 was the ICO from Block One for EOS. And reading through the white paper and looking at what was being mentioned as, or promised, or described in the white paper really attracted me. And so along with a group of colleagues, we decided that EOS would be the space that we would be building on, that we'd be deploying our time, resources, energy on. And so we formed a group, EOS Nation. The idea behind EOS Nation was that we would be a block producer within the space, and essentially validators within EOS, because we had the capacity, we had the kind of the background, the experience, the skill set to be able to fulfill that function. It was a new network. I had a lot of promise. It had a lot of capital. And so we thought that we would likely have a really good chance of starting at the ground level for a layer 1 Gen 3 blockchain that had a lot of promise. And yeah, we launched EOS, and we were, I guess, for the first 4 years of the network, we're a block producer on the network.
Oh, wow. Now, just last May, you resigned as CEO of EOS Nation, and you began to kind of think about a new path. And we're curious now where it's led you over the last year.
So the first 3.5 years in EOS have been extremely difficult. The network had a lot of failing. So the network itself, the tech stack, is incredibly strong. The foundations to the network are incredibly good. But one of the failings with EOS was that it never had a centralized or a foundation, essentially, that other chains launched with. And so at the onset, through the ICO raise, a lot of people within the ecosystem believed that Block One would be the entity to fulfill that function. They'd promised and they made commitments to redeploy a significant portion of that ICO back into the ecosystem in order to essentially sustain development over a lengthy period of time. Without going into too much detail in there, that really didn't pan out. But the system itself, the tech stack behind it itself, were incredibly powerful. What EOS was missing, and still arguably is missing today, is everything else that comes alongside to make an ecosystem successful. So although the tech stack itself was great, there's very little marketing for it. There's very little financial and non-financial support to people, developers, businesses, individuals trying to build in the space. And so having that experience over 3.5 years, when I left EOS Nation, I had a really good time, or a lengthy period of time, to be able to reflect, how could I come and essentially fill the gaps that I was seeing, or that I'd experienced over the last 3 years, which really led to the creation of the foundation. EOS, one of its faults was that it is highly decentralized. The way that the block producers and the network is built, there really is no central authority. And so it's quite chaotic in that sense. And so the deployment of capital, or the capacity to be able to, let's say, focus on a direction or roadmap was lacking. And that is typically what a foundation provides is that central point of communication, but that central point as well of direction and guidance that EOS was lacking. And so that led me to create, through the network that I built, but also the understanding of the tech stack, the understanding of the history of where we got there, led me to create the foundation.
Interesting. So for practical purposes, how exactly does it work? Just in
which
the
part?
space
The foundation, or?
Well, let's start with EOS Nation first of all, and the work that you've done there. So how does it then get applied?
Sure. So, I mean, validators in EOS or block producers in EOS are very similar to mining pools in other ecosystems. So they provide the backbone, the infrastructure for the network to operate. And so it's a different consensus protocol in EOS. So there's less hardware, let's say, than what you would find in a traditional proof of stake or proof of work chain. So it's very similar to proof of stake, where there's highly specialized infrastructure that's running, but it's really off-the-shelf infrastructure. They're not specific miners or not specialized miners. They provide the backbone of the operational infrastructure for the network at a very, very low cost. And so that enables the network to be highly performant in terms of throughput and highly scalable. And so it is somewhat of a trade-off between being extremely decentralized in the sense of hardware, where there's tons and tons of miners or different nodes located. In EOS, there are, I would say, closer to maybe 500 to 1,000 nodes. And of those nodes, there's 21 of them that are selected through a consensus mechanism, an ongoing half a second, essentially. It's an election that's ongoing every half a second. Of delegated proof of stake that determines who's going to be the nodes or the entities producing the blocks for the network, validating the information for the network. And EOS Nation was fulfilling that role and is still fulfilling that role today as a block producer.
I see. Okay. And so now with the foundation and the work that you're doing there, so maybe now that you've given us the foundation for EOS Nation, the foundation itself, how is that now applied in this space?
So when the foundation was created, as I mentioned before, part of what was lacking in the ecosystem was directed funding towards certain functions that an ecosystem typically would deem to be either public goods or services that a network would typically subsidize in order to lay the foundations for an ecosystem to have the base to be able to thrive. And so that can come in multiple ways, but there's obviously financial support and then non-financial support. So financial support in EOS happens through multiple buckets. So we've got a grant framework, we've got a quadratic funding a portal mechanism that's matching pools from the community, and then we've got also a governance layer that occurs through political playoffs, a system called Eden. All of those buckets essentially have different mechanisms to filter out or to be able to determine which applications, which individuals, which projects should receive funding. And the foundation really is the main coordinator for that. So the foundation has access to funding. It seeks funding from the block producers. It seeks funding from the network. And then it deploys that capital in very specific areas that the network, the community, the token holders essentially have highlighted through various processes are areas that should be funded in a very coordinated and efficient fashion. So since the creation of the foundation, we've deployed roughly $20 million, but our running rate, let's say operational rate for the year will stabilize around $60 to $100 million. And all of that capital goes towards either public goods, so components of the network that are essentially non-excludable and non-rival risk, something like the strengthening of APIs, history node providers, portals for launch pads, EVM compatibility, things that typically networks deem at this stage anyways in 2022 are things that blockchains see as essential components to create essentially a thriving ecosystem. The foundation is the one that coordinates that and that goes out, that is a legal entity that can actually contract that and can deploy those funds in a very efficient manner.
Very, very fascinating. I wanted to go back just a little bit because when you walked away with your degree in psychology, you then moved to Japan and you lived there for some 6 years. I'm curious what, if there was an impression upon you culturally that also sort of expanded your ideas in terms of kind of going after blockchain and continuing down this path. If there was anything that you took away from the culture that led you to where you are today.
Definitely. So the intent to go to Japan was to go for a year, do a gap year after university, and then come back and, as I mentioned before, go to med school. And that 1 year ended up lasting 6 years. So I fell in love with the culture. I fell in love with the people, with the language, with the food. And through that 6-year process, really, I got to expand and to look at the world in a different way than I was, let's say, accustomed to, or I grew up in the West. And that is highly relevant to what I'm doing today with the foundation and what I did with the block producers as well, because a large part of not just the EOS community, but blockchain community as a whole is located in Asia. And culturally, obviously, they're very different language-wise, et cetera, but also the way that people or developers approach and that businesses approach certain challenges, or the way that they approach investment, having that background of looking at the world in a way, like in a different way, like somewhat of a mirror, it's very opposite in some regards, really has helped me to bridge that gap. And again, it goes back to a lot of my studies. It's been multidisciplinary, bridging the gap between different things, right? So behavioral economics or neurocomputational psychology. And so it's two different fields that are essentially bridging the gap. And one of the things that I've been doing with the foundation, but as a block producer as well, that really stemmed from my time in Asia, was bridging that gap between the East and the West, and really trying to empower both areas to be able to look at things differently and seeing where we can fit or where we can find ourselves in the middle. And I really find that what that does is that you end up getting a stronger product at the end. You get something that's a little bit more widespread in its application, but also opens its eyes to different ways of doing things and different ways of looking at the same thing, which ultimately leads to, let's say, a more stronger or sustainable product.
Mm-hmm. What city did you live in Japan, if you don't mind asking?
So I was in the Nagoya region. So I was living, I was going to say Inaka region. So I was living in rural Japan, in Gifu, basically, or actually even further than that. But yes, I was living in the middle of nowhere. I had rice paddies all around me. I was living at the base of the Southern Alps and Northern Alps. It was a terrific region. And really what that enabled me to do was learn the language and the culture. And so I spent a lot of time in Tokyo, and I spent a lot of time in Nagoya and Fukuoka and Osaka, but really my home base was in the middle of nowhere in Japan. And so I had to learn the language.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because when you think about just kind of discovering yourself and the various interests that you have, technologically speaking, to be in a rural part of a country, it seems almost the antithesis of, being kind of in the middle of everything and having access at your fingertips. So would you say that being out in the country kind of helped you also not just learn the culture and the language, but maybe to contemplate your own path forward?
Definitely. And I think that blockchain also embodies that, where you're trying to take traditional systems and really modernize them. And living in Japan in a rural area was very much so that dichotomy that you could find in rural Japan, or at really any rural parts of the world. But my experience in Japan was having that very traditional classical kind of sense and surrounding, marred by or located within a very advanced, technologically advanced, because Japan is incredibly technologically advanced. Simple things like when you open a door and the toilet opens up for yourself and whatnot, like just the dichotomy and the very opposite nature of where I was within that space is very similar to what I find within blockchain, taking traditional systems and trying to bridge them essentially to the future. So definitely, yes.
Fascinating, fascinating. A question that I have for you. So people, looking forward to EOS's transformation after it weighed legal action against Block One. Curious how that's going now.
So I can't comment, obviously, on an ongoing investigation, but essentially, the network has deemed that Block One has been, I guess, didn't live up to its commitments, its publicly stated commitments, and the network is going to and is in the process of holding Block One accountable to those promises made. And so it's much greater than the ICO. It's the ongoing, essentially, commitments that they've made over a period of time that led to people deploying capital on a network and building on a network with somewhat of an idea in mind of what this particular entity would be doing. And ultimately, they never did, or they very little of the commitments and the promises they made were fulfilled, and that led to a lot of distress, financial distress, to a lot of individuals. And so, holding Block One accountable is the process by which we're going through right now. But I can't comment further on the ongoing investigation.
Appreciate that. And not sure if we totally touched on Trust EVM. Anything of note that you want to make sure that our audiences know about it?
Sure. So EOS has been lacking EVM compatibility now for 4 years. And one of the great things with that Ethereum and the Ethereum community was able to do is build an immense library of tools and libraries accessible to new developers. And this is why we're seeing a lot of the blockchains within the space become EVM compatible, so that they can actually take advantage of and incorporate a lot of those tools and open themselves effectively to a larger group of developers. And EOS has been lacking that now for a few years. So EOS has tremendous power within its native layer one solution. It's extremely powerful. It is very much battle tested over 4 years, no downtime at all. But it lacks kind of that openness to other networks. And EVM compatibility really opens the doors so that others that have spent their time building elsewhere can deploy what they've spent, deploy what they've built on EOS. And EOS essentially is able to run all of Ethereum within a single smart contract, and is incredibly powerful. And so we'd be able to do that with other blockchains as well. And the idea is not necessarily to take away or remove from, is really to open doors, is to build bridges, is to be able to create more highways, to be able to link those chains together, so that people that have spent tremendous amount of time and created amazing products elsewhere are able to come and leverage what EOS has to offer in terms of speed and low cost, as well as scalability to those applications, to those developers. So the EVM with full RPC compatibility has been live now for a little over a month on testnet on EOS, and it is on track to be able to deploy with Silkhorn compatibility and the Graph compatibility this fall, so September approximately.
Oh, wow. And how does it bring its users a step closer to the real Web 3.0 world?
It's a really good question. I think that going back to what you mentioned with the actions against Block One, back in December, the EOS network effectively fired Block One as a custodian on the network. So Block One had been receiving vesting tokens, essentially as a contractor. In a way, Block One was taking care of the software stack, and they were getting paid by the network. EOS showcased very much in Web3 fashion that when a network feels that it is under threat, or that it is, let's say, corporate entity or corporate interest no longer align with its own interest as a decentralized network, that it can take action. And so EOS really, for me, embodies that Web3 spirit of taking the power back into the hands and really placing it into the hands of the token holders, of the community members. And so in that sense, in that regard, since the creation of the foundation, which is very different than other foundations, the network effectively has embodied that spirit of Web3. So when I say different in terms of foundation, is that a lot of the majority of the other blockchain networks launched with foundations. So those foundations were appointed at the onset. They were empowered with token allocation from the circulating supply at the onset. And they started essentially with massive treasuries, and they have control over that. So there's no other foundation that could come and let's say move them or take over that role within the ecosystem. In EOS, it is the only blockchain that I know of whereby there was no foundation at the onset, and the foundation was created from the ground up through grassroots, which is very much Web3, and empowered by the token holders, empowered by the network validators to be able to continue its existence. So the EOS Network Foundation doesn't actually have a treasury. It is a non-for-profit, non-solicitation designation status entity within Canada. So the idea is that the foundation continuously has to remain accountable to the token holders and the network validators in order to continuously get that funding. So if the foundation no longer was aligned with the network could easily remove or stop funding it, effectively stopping it. Or if another foundation or another group of individuals or another entity felt that it could do a better job, it could come and seek to replace the current foundation. So it's very much in the spirit of Web3, where the token holders and the community has power and control over the network.
So interesting. All right, so I have to ask you this, Yves. So your life has taken various directions, psychology and then now technology. Do you have a mentor? Was there someone who was instrumental in your life that helped you along this journey?
I definitely have multiple mentors. And so I guess I was fortunate because, as you mentioned, I've moved around a lot. I do tend to do a lot at once. I don't sleep very much. I guess I have that capacity. I don't need much sleep. And over the years in the positions that I've been very fortunate to be able to be surrounded by tremendous mentors. So there's more than one mentor that I can think of. Wherever I'm whatever it is I'm doing, I get very much involved with what I'm doing. I go all in, so to speak. And so throughout the space, I've got mentors currently on EOS, some of the people that I've been working with over the last couple of years. Right now, I guess I would say that even one of my mentors is on my executive team. And so the COO that I put in place is much older than I am. And he's had a long span, a long career within traditional let's say space or traditional enterprise. And to a certain extent, he's somewhat of a mentor. And then more traditionally as well, I've got people throughout my life that have followed me, friends or family or people that I've worked with in the past, that when I left those employments or when I left those fields, we really kept in touch. And I've been able to continuously tap into somewhat my own journey and find out where I have to grow as an individual. And so there's multiple.
What do you think is some of the best career advice you ever received?
Something that's really simple. So one of my mentors that I got through I guess somewhat of an official mentorship program while I was working for the government of Canada. We were at lunch one day and he said something that was so simple that really stuck with me. We were talking about how to approach projects and how to approach at that time, I don't know how it came about, but he was talking about doing dishes, and he was trying to, I guess, highlight a concept. And he said, when you're doing dishes, you can do dishes in multiple ways. And some people just approach doing dishes as just doing the dishes and just kind of go at it and don't really have a method to it. But some people approach doing dishes in a different way. And the way that he was saying that you should be approaching doing dishes is starting off with the cleaner items at the onset. So you start washing the plates or whatnot that are somewhat cleaner, so that then your bag or whatever it is you're using, your sponge, doesn't get dirty, and you finish with the dirty products instead of dirtying your sponge at the onset and then end up dirtying the clean products. It was something so simple, but it really highlighted that when approaching a problem, you should take the time to actually think about it, reflect upon it, and see what the impacts will be in how you prioritize, let's say, approaching something.
That's great advice. I never really thought about it before. I'm not going to look at a dish the same way now.
Yeah, I never have since.
Yeah. And what do you think is the most rewarding moment that you've had just since getting into blockchain and going through this process?
I think the creation of the foundation, and I know it's somewhat cliche, but when I left EOS Nation and I resigned, it really gave me an opportunity to reflect whether or not I wanted to stay within the ecosystem, within the EOS ecosystem. And during that period of time, it was extremely difficult. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, whether or not I was going to stay or leave. And a lot of people within the ecosystem reached out and really offered encouragement, support, and saw that there was a specific role that I would be able to play to essentially lead EOS going forward. And leading to that creation of the foundation where on EOS, effectively to be able to get funding, that's through a process called an MSIG. So you put an MSIG would be like an on-chain decision or on-chain vote. And that vote was put up, and within, I believe it was less than 48 hours, I'd gotten the support of the largest stakeholders, the block producers, and the token holders, which effectively allocated at the time, I think it was about $18 million. So it was about a Series A level raise, but it was done within 48 hours. And so that was, tremendous level of support shown from the EOS community within a very short period of time.
Absolutely. What is your advice for those who want to join this space, who want to join the blockchain industry?
Take risks. One of the things that we quickly forget, and this is within the blockchain space, but outside of it as well, is as systems grow and they become more mature, they tend to slow down, they tend to centralize, and they tend to become more risk adverse. And it's easy if you've been in this space for a long time to somewhat become complacent to the fact that you're in such a nascent field and that innovation really is what's driving this right now. So the biggest advice that I'd say is iterate frequently, and iterate. Mistakes are okay. Make mistakes. If you're making mistakes, that means that you're trying. And really, we have this opportunity within this space right now to be able to make a lot of mistakes and make them frequently. And as we started in the discussion, this idea of failures or making mistakes, if you look at it from a different perspective, there are opportunities to grow, opportunities to learn. And this is what this space needs right now, are people that are comfortable with making mistakes and being able to learn from those mistakes and being able to take what they've learned and then apply it so that they can keep growing. So it doesn't mean become complacent and attempt to make mistakes. It's being comfortable with this idea that you will make mistakes. You are pioneering. There's nobody else that's done it before you. There's no magic little book that's telling you and that's got an instruction list of what to do. And that requires a particular mindset. And so open yourself up to that possibility and iterate frequently.
It's like what we were talking about earlier about failure. They're really not failures. These are building blocks and stepping stones to success and discovery. So it's rather akin, I would say.
Yeah, nobody's been here before, so nobody's going to tell you what to do. Take the opportunity and try something. And this is what I really love about the space, is because it is so nascent. Everybody's essentially pioneering. Oftentimes, what you're doing, you're the first person or the first entity, the first team to do so. And there's someone that's quite magical. And so take a moment as well to appreciate what you're doing and what you're doing, what you're contributing to.
So what do you think are the potentials of EOS that you see in the near future? What things are going to be focused on in the next couple of years? DeFi, GameFi, NFTs?
Yeah, so we saw that every summer, and summer is coming up, there's somewhat a new theme to the blockchain space. And so as years go by, we have different, I think 2 years ago or so was maybe more DeFi. Last year was really NFT focused. I think that this year is really going to be focusing on GameFi and DAG, so decentralized autonomous gamers guilds. And where I see this going is that every step along the way, you start seeing more real world applications or more linkages to I guess, technologies or applications that are currently seeing the potential of blockchain. And this year, as you mentioned, GameFi, I think, is going to be a big one. And GameFi really embodies somewhat, again, the multidisciplinary, the combination of DeFi and NFTs to a certain extent, but within a very specific realm of gaming. And so you start to see a lot of pay to play, sorry, not pay to play, but play to earn models, really leveraging the power of NFTs combined with the speed and throughput that the blockchains, especially at this point, are capable of providing. So microtransactions, micropayments, essentially being able to scale the function of blockchain and that the technology stack, being able to leverage that power in real world applications now. And so for me, summer 2022 is really going to be GameFi. And then the kind of the complementary end to this is being able to have the technologies and the portals or the functions for players and for users to be able to assemble and to be able to create communities. And so that's what when I mentioned decentralized autonomous gamer guilds or DAGs, it's being able to leverage the power of DAOs, but when in a very specific realm of gaming. So having those tools and those functions available for users so that not only they can play the games and they can earn by playing the games and leverage that side of things, but they can also assemble and create communities around that, but in a very decentralized fashion where the guilds or the users essentially have the power within their own and over their own communities.
Wonderful. And what are your thoughts on the metaverse?
The metaverse is interesting. So it kind of, again, takes what I just described, but places it in an augmented reality type of environment. And so we've seen, especially with the pandemic, that people have grown accustomed to working remotely. People have gotten used to the idea of basically collaborating remotely. Way more than was, let's say, previously customary outside of the blockchain space. And that's why I make that parallel is within the blockchain space, a lot of people have been working remotely for quite some time. And so it wasn't necessarily new to a lot of people. But now with more traditional enterprises joining the blockchain and starting to see the potential within the blockchain, the metaverse, I think, will come in to help being able to, again, somewhat create that bridge between being able to work remotely, being able to collaborate remotely, but having an extra little something where people can, I guess, create connections. And so we're starting to see the power of blockchain being leveraged through the metaverse, and that metaverse being able to somewhat expand on creating relationships in a different way that we haven't really been accustomed to in the past as much. And so being able to be on video teleconference with this creates a connection. There's a certain level of connection, but when you speak to people, oftentimes they'll still say that in person, there's the little something extra. And the metaverse really just brings that little something extra. And so you're not quite there yet, but you're definitely more than what we are right now. And so being able to leverage that space just, again, brings humans closer. It brings us closer as people. It increases collaboration. Increasing collaboration, hopefully that leads to more innovation, which then just creates that cycle of improvement.
It certainly
so
feels
I think
like
metaverses are really key to this.
Right. It certainly feels like the world is getting smaller exponentially. So
yes, at the same time, speed, though, people say that it's getting larger as well. So people are, as much as we're getting closer, our relationships are growing further, if that makes sense. And yes, Metaverse is somewhat come and attempt to help in that regard. So a lot of people, you're connected to a lot of people, but you end up being very lonely as well because you're always physically alone. And that the Metaverse really kind of helps in that regard, I think.
Yeah, isn't that something? And not to get too anecdotal here, but just during the pandemic and when everything was in lockdown, people were holed up in their homes, but we had all this technology to engage with one another. We certainly had social media that was very well established, but it seems like coming out of it, people were lonelier as a result. How do you describe, as a psychologist, how do you describe that phenomena?
there's something that's inherently different about being in person with people. Even just having a drink with somebody, you get to know people on a different level. And so as much as we're getting to know each other right now, if we were somewhere and we were having a drink, we would likely be a little bit more intimate. We would likely talk about ourselves a little bit more and be a little bit less formal. And right now there is a barrier. There's a physical barrier between us. There's a geographical distance barrier that exists between us right now. And there's a screen between us as well. And that creates inevitably a distance between us. And that distance or that barrier breaks down or falls apart when you're in person. And it's very interesting to see. People are more vulnerable when they're in person. So especially if we look at introverts versus extroverts, introverts, right now are opening themselves up much more during the pandemic because of this barrier that exists. They feel somewhat of a safety net between being behind a screen. They're able to control it a little bit more. They're able to maybe even control their look, control their background. They have more control over the situation. Whereas extroverts, they're feeling a little bit more lonely because they're not able to take advantage of that presence and kind of control the in-person situation. And so you see that no matter how close we are, there's something that's completely different with being in person. That vulnerability that exists with being in person is not found by video teleconference or even in the metaverse, I guess, to a certain extent. And it's that vulnerability, that inherent vulnerability of being physically close to somebody that is, I think, lacking right now. And that creates that distance. Because once you're vulnerable, you open up. And when you open up is when you really let somebody in. And that's what creates the connection. It's really letting somebody in. And that's what we're still lacking. And that's what I guess was very difficult, especially for extroverts during the pandemic.
True. That is true.
But it was also a safety net for introverts. So it goes both ways.
That is true. Absolutely. So do you think, though, that the metaverse is going to make people feel more connected, or do you think could it do both? Could it make people feel more connected and more isolated?
So I think depending on the personality, the metaverse will be a tremendous tool for people who don't feel safe being in person or who have this inherent, for whatever reason, self-defense mechanism that kicks in when they are in person. The metaverse really allows them, or will likely allow them, to be able to open up in ways that they've never been able to open up before because they still have control over the situation. And so for them, that will be a tremendous tool. At the same time, those who don't necessarily have that self-defense mechanism, I don't think will find themselves as much in the metaverse. So it'll be nice. It'll be an extra step. It'll be something good, but they will still crave that in-person relationship that they need in order to feel energized, right? For some people, being in person and being very social and being touchy-feely or whatever, that energizes them, and they're still going to be missing that. So I don't think we're going away with in-person events. I don't think we're going away with being able to be in person, but I think the frequency at which we do so and how we remain connected after we're no longer in person, that's where the metaverse really kicks in for some people.
Okay, I appreciate that. Well, I just have a few more questions for you, Yves. We're almost done here. This is just a very fun little segment of questions that I have for you, and feel free to be as short with your answers as you'd like. I mean, just maximum 20 seconds, just a little quick fire here. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Vancouver Island.
And why is that?
It is, again, somewhat closer to Asia, which I spend a lot of time in. It is an amazing, wonderful place if ever you get a chance to go. So the North American Northwest coast, let's say, is an amazing place. If you like nature, the weather is more temperate than where I'm located as well, which is nice. So warmer winters, a little bit cooler summers, and just overall ocean, mountains. For me, that's heaven.
Very nice. What is your proudest accomplishment?
I'd say becoming a father. That was something that I always wanted to do, and becoming a father has really opened up my eyes to looking at the world in a very different way.
How many children do you have?
only one, and he's going to be 3 years old in 2 months. And so
happy birthday to
am
him.
in full swing. Yeah.
Beautiful. What characteristics do you like most about yourself?
I'm very driven. I'm very competitive. I'm very passionate.
And what's the most interesting thing that you've read or seen this week?
I was working on a project, and somebody within that project included a letter from George Washington to Horace. And that letter was really interesting. It was talking about slavery at the time. And George Washington was describing why he was against slavery. And it wasn't necessarily because he thought slavery was wrong, but it was that was what was better for the nation that he was trying to create at the time. And so it was a really interesting take on, and that letter was really interesting to read.
Very good. What is one story about your childhood that best explains the man that you are today?
I was fortunate to be able to grow around many uncles. So French Canadian families are quite large. And a lot of my uncles were software engineers, electrical engineers, etc. And so I grew up with computers surrounded around me, which really leads me to where I am today.
And what famous 3 people would you love to have, dead or alive, at a dinner party?
George Washington, just because I mentioned that letter, and it'd be great to be able to pick his brain and of what he was trying to create at the time with the United States, or prior to the United States. Michael Jordan, because I watched the Netflix documentary on him. He's an incredibly talented but driven and competitive individual, and I really find myself within that. I'll leave it at those 2 because I can't think of the third one right now.
Okay, well, you'll be the 3rd dinner guest then. And looking to the second half of this year, what is on tap for you? What are your plans?
So we'll be going on the road quite a bit. So now that the pandemic has reopened doors, let's say, to travel, we're going to be going back on the road. I'll be in Singapore, South Korea and Singapore in September, likely in the UK and London in November. But essentially showcasing what we've been working on over the last 8 months with the foundation on the road, being able to showcase essentially the reinvigorated community that is found on EOS and what it's doing and what has been doing over the last couple of months and where it's heading.
Fantastic. Well, Yves, I want to thank you so very much for taking all this time to speak with us and to share your career, your thoughts, your philosophies. It really, truly has been a pleasure.
Likewise, Layla. Thank you very much. This has been an incredible interview.